Nicole, I wonder if we can talk a little bit, and the overall premise of your work is that we really haven't made serious progress in treatment for diseases of the brain. And I wonder if you can just kind of set the stage for us about what you mean by that and why it's of concern.
First, I think we have to be a little bit thoughtful when we use that term disease, because not all of the conditions we'll be talking about today are diseases, and some of them we might even not want to call them disorders. So there are legitimate concerns that there are certain classes.
We'll dig into that as well.
Like,
that's great.
That are really, forms of neurodiversity that society maybe has wrongly become intolerant to. So examples of that might be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, autism spectrum disorder. So when we use this term, we definitely want to be thoughtful about how we're using it, and with really in an empathetic spirit, right? There are individuals who are diagnosed with conditions, and maybe they don't think of themselves as having a condition. And then there are other individuals who want and need treatment. And it's really those individuals that we're talking about today, the ones that want and need treatment, and our treatments are falling short of anything that we have to offer them. So it's not that we haven't made progress in anything, right? So there have been these game-changing drugs, these breakthroughs where big discoveries about the brain lead to a new therapy. And cases of that are things like the new sleep drugs and new drugs for migraine. But there are classes of disorders that have really just been really difficult to understand what causes them and understand how to create new treatments. And so those three classes are our neurodegenerative conditions, so things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, our neuropsychiatric conditions, so depression, anxiety, psychosis, and then the intellectual disability. So these are neurodevelopmental disorders like intellectual disability. Another neurodevelopmental disorder is autism spectrum disorder.
Let's take maybe one of the conditions as a way of talking about it. Let's take depression. And when we think about depression as a condition, what have we learned, and why do you think it's not enough?
So in some sense, we all know what causes certain cases of depression, right? We all know someone who has gone through a very traumatic experience, which they didn't necessarily recover back to full force from, like the death of a loved one. We all know about the role of poverty and trauma, and it's creating the susceptibility to depression. So that's kind of those types of causes are ones that live outside the brain. So these are external causes.
Okay.
And so then there's a question of, well, what's happening inside the brain as a consequence of those causes? And in some cases, it's also, we know that some individuals with depression, you can't really point to any one external event that happened to them. They just seem to enter or be susceptible or more sensitive to bouts of depression. So one of the big mysteries for a very long time has been what's been happening inside the brain. Back in the 1960s, there started to be these ideas that maybe depression is about a chemical imbalance of the brain.
Right.
So we serendipitously discovered this class of drugs that we call the antidepressants. And those were discovered, it was a fascinating story behind that one. The first antidepressant was discovered when they were doing clinical trials for the lung-infecting bacteria tuberculosis. And what they found is the people who took this drug in the clinical trials were dancing around. They were joyous. And so they said, well, maybe this could be mood uplifting. And so this was the first clinical trial for an antidepressant. So we've had many antidepressants since, and we've even learned a lot about how they operate at the chemical level in our brain. So when two brain cells connect together, they release a chemical in order to facilitate that communication. And these antidepressants, they modify how much chemical is released or how long it's released and so on. So this led to this idea about the chemical imbalance theory.
Right.
But fast forward, it doesn't explain everything. So for example, some of these antidepressants, they increase the amount of chemical that's released into the synapse between these two brain cells that are communicating. But that happens pretty quickly after you start taking these drugs. And the drugs themselves, in terms of their mood uplifting properties, that doesn't kick in for weeks or months. So there's a big question, what's happening during those weeks and months in order to make antidepressants work? There's so much we don't know about the brain and depression. We can't put someone in a brain scanner and determine whether or not they're going through a depressive or a psychotic episode, for example. We can't look at a brain and determine if it's depressed. We don't even really understand how our brains take our experiences and transform them into our moods. So it turns out that emotion research, mood research is a really, really difficult area of neuroscience. And so while we're beginning to make some progress in that realm, it's because we're starting to think about the brain in a slightly different way, not as there's a broken step in a really long chain, and that step is chemicals. That might be embracing the brain more and thinking about this new way, embracing more of its complexity. And that's what I talk about in Elusive Cures.
Yeah, and so this, in some ways, you talk about this approach is the molecular neuroscience framework, which kind of, to me, helps set up an understanding of how we have historically thought of how the brain is working. Can you expand a little bit more on that for me, please?
Yeah, so back in the 1990s, neuroscience really began to adopt this way of thinking about the brain, which in the book I introduce as the molecular neuroscience framework. And what it does is it envisions the brain as a very long sequence of dominoes that are all kind of tied together. So it's a very satisfying way to think about how anything works. We've all done the thing, right, where we set up the dominoes.
And very logical.
We tip the first one and they all fall into.
Yep.
Yes, it's very logical. It's about how causes lead to effects.
Right.
And so this domino chain was really set up with the emergence of some remarkable technologies, including the ability to sequence genes and also to image what's happening in the brain non-invasively using a technique called MRI that I'm sure many of the listeners have actually had done to themselves. So the way the molecular neuroscience framework works is it all begins with the genes. So genes then are expressed, and that creates a program that's used to create brain cells. The brain cells are wired together into these brain circuits, and it's the activation of those brain circuits that leads to all of our functions and dysfunctions. So everything that we do, seeing, hearing, remembering, deciding, imagining. And the idea then is that if there's a type of dysfunction, like maybe Alzheimer's disease or perhaps psychosis, that is reflected in our patterns of brain activity. Now, there's a single feedback loop in this idea such that our environments, what we experience, actually shapes how our brains are wired up. And that happens via feedback, or we input these experiences through our senses, and then that reshapes these brain circuits by changing how the genes are expressed. And that was the molecular neuroscience framework. It caused a lot of brain researchers, including myself, to focus on how causes lead to effects in the brain, like how the expression of a gene leads to one of these brain circuits, or how activity leads to behavior. And so that was really the agenda of that era, was to map these cause-effect chains, and under the presumption that dysfunction follows from a broken domino in the chain, the goal is to pinpoint the broken domino, and then we can go in and target it for a fix.
And that applies to any type of condition. Is that right? That it was all?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. Now, the implications of this level of understanding has had some pretty big restrictions, not only in terms, it sounds like, in your mind, of how we have come to understand these different conditions, but arguably even how drug companies are choosing or not choosing to invest in continuing to look for answers.
Absolutely. So with this idea that it's singular broken dominoes in the chain that are causing individuals' disorders, there was a hunt for finding the broken dominoes and then targeting them for a fix. And in the case of something that had to do with the molecular level, like a gene that was expressed, maybe a genetic variation or mutation, the idea was that we would target that level with a drug. And so there was the pharmaceutical industry was very interested in trying to target those broken dominoes with exquisite selectivity. There were lots of mottos of that era. One disease, one drug, one molecule type of mottos. Yeah.
And so in terms of this whole idea of when, again, the human genome sequence, it just didn't lead to those solutions. And so when was the realization that this approach was not delivering what the expected and hoped for outcome was going to be?
Yeah, it happened gradually. It unfolded across decades. In some cases, you will get a disorder that can actually be linked directly to the mutation of an individual gene. One example of that is cystic fibrosis is always the mutation of a single gene. There are other types of disorders that are weakly linked to maybe one or a handful of genes. Alzheimer's is an interesting case for many individuals. If you inherit a variant of Alzheimer's, it will increase your risk for getting Alzheimer's, but it won't insure it. And then there are other classes of disorders that are linked to hundreds of genes very, very weakly. And this is the example of some of the psychiatric conditions. So depression, anxiety, autism, these schizophrenia. If you inherit these variants, it will increase your risk, but really there's a weak link between the disorder and the genes that you inherit, not one of these strong links for particular genes.
Okay, which leads us to this idea as you're promoting in your book about it's time, for lack of a better word, of a new grand plan. And I wonder what you mean by that, and how is that message beginning to be received?
The way that researchers have been approaching the brain, while it was technology limited, and it was in fact useful. It set a foundation for what we need to know, but it isn't sufficient. And the problem is we've been massively oversimplifying the brain. The brain is held up as the most complex thing in the entire universe. And so you can ask the question, what's so complicated about it? A domino chain, maybe it has many levels, but domino chains ultimately aren't really that complicated, right? So what's so complicated about the brain? The brain is full of these feedback loops. So causes that lead to effects that feed back on themselves as causes. And we know a lot about systems
not
like
linear.
these. They're called complex dynamical systems. It's not linear. It's a highly nonlinear system. It's much more like the weather, ecosystems, nuclear reactors. We know that these types of systems have special properties.
Okay.
And it's because their parts interact in interesting ways. They're often called emergent properties because they're so surprising when they happen. And we also know that in these types of systems, when you try to intervene or work with them, you can have these small changes that you introduce can have big, unpredictable effects. And the weather is a great example of that. As we all know, we cannot control the weather. And it's not because we haven't tried. It's not because we're energy limited. It's because of what's called the butterfly effect. So a small perturbation to the weather can lead to a big, unpredictable effect later on.
Right.
And so that's what I realized when writing this book. The big, formidable challenge that we're up against in our quest to create treatments for these conditions is that small perturbations into the brain can also have big, unpredictable effects. That's the side effects of all of our drugs, for example. And it's because the brain is one of these complex systems with so many parts that are interacting. Now, I have a lot of hope that we'll be able to create treatments to shift the brain from unhealthy to healthy states, but it's not going to be as simple as targeting a broken domino for a fix. It's going to be something much more complicated than that. And that's the formidable challenge that we're up against.